loves, welcome back. Today we're going to do my March and April books video. Very excited about it, but I have an absolutely huge stack. So I'm going to try and be fairly quick moving through these books, otherwise we're going to be here forever. So this is my massive stack, and there are a few that I don't have physically. So we have lots to talk about, but before we do, let me quickly tell you about May and June's book club picks. I'll try and remember to actually put these on Instagram as well if you're interested. Of course, you can just read them and then hear me speak about them and chat about them in the comments of this video or of the next video if you want to, but we obviously have our Patreon book club where we can discuss these books in greater detail. There is a link down below as always. But the first one is Dawn by Octavia Butler. I am a huge Octavia Butler fan. I have read a lot of her work actually, but this trilogy, this is the first book, I have not read, and apparently it's one of her best, so I'm really excited about it. It's alternately known as either the Lilith's Brood trilogy or the Xenogenesis trilogy. When Lilith Iapo wakes in a small white room with no doors or windows, she remembers a devastating war and a husband and child long lost to her. She finds herself living among the Oankali, a strange race who intervened in the fate of humanity hundreds of years before. They spared those they could from the ruined earth and suspended them in a long deep sleep. Over centuries, the Oankali learned from the past, cured disease and healed the world. Now they want Lilith to lead her people back home. But salvation comes at a price. To restore humanity, it must be changed forever. Sounds really good. It's much loved, and I'm really looking forward to reading and discussing that one. Our June pick is this teeny tiny little book. This is James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. I've been meaning to read this for such a long time, and I'm really looking forward to this one as well. So I think they're both going to be amazing, but in completely different ways. So the blurb for this: David, a young American in 1950s Paris, is waiting for his fiancée to return from vacation in Spain. But when he meets Giovanni, a handsome Italian barman, the two men are drawn into an intense affair. After 3 months, David's fiancée returns, and denying who he is, he rejects Giovanni for a safe future as a married man. It is a decision that will bring tragedy. So that's Giovanni's Room. Right, into some books that I have read now. First up, I'm going to talk about the book club picks for March and April. For March, it was Stay With Me by bámi Adébáyọ. This is her first novel. She's obviously released one pretty recently as well. This is about Yejide. She really wants to have a child, basically, but her and her husband are struggling to conceive, and his mother-in-law insists that her husband takes a second wife. It's set in 1980s Nigeria, and you get a little bit of that history in there as well, but not quite as much as the blurb suggests, and I would have liked to see a bit more about that time in Nigeria myself. I just wanted it to be a more historical novel, I think, than it was. When I read the first few pages, it really reminded me of His Only Wife, which I read a couple years ago, but I do think this one went into a little bit more depth on some of its themes, and had a little bit more complexity in some of the characters, but generally stuck to kind of a family-based plot line. There are a couple of twists in here. I thought this was a solid read. Generally, we thought it was a solid read in book club, but I don't think many of us were completely wowed by it. I think it could have gone into a little bit more depth on some things, and some of the twists were interesting and believable, and some of them were quite shocking and not so much. So that was that one. A solid read, but not hugely memorable. And then we have When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro. This one really split the crowd for book club. I liked it. It was a reread for me. I read it about 10 years ago. So I remembered very little of it, so it kind of felt quite fresh and new anyway. I think I liked it slightly less than I did first time round, just because I've read so much since that whilst I could see what Ishiguro was trying to do in this book, I'm not sure it was wholly or completely successful. At the same time, he subverts so many of your expectations. It's sort of an interesting read just based on that alone, but it's about Christopher Banks. It's set in the 1930s. He is a famous detective, but he grew up in Shanghai to British parents, and then both of those parents went missing when he was around 10 years old, I think, and he was sent back to England, which is supposedly his home, but didn't feel like his home really. So in the second half of this novel, he decides he wants to solve his parents' disappearance. The first half of this novel is fairly straightforward, and then it really tips into the surreal, because Christopher is about as unreliable as they get when it comes to narrators. It's quite fun picking up on all the little clues and things that make him so unreliable and make you question what exactly is happening. There's a lot of strange patches, especially in the second half of the book, when you just think, what is going on here? Like, this doesn't make sense. I think it's all intentional, but it just stops short of quite working. I think it's just missing a little bit more textual evidence one way or another about certain scenes and plot developments. As it is slightly too confused. And it doesn't make the most out of that tip into the surreal, I think. That's my kind of conclusion on it, but I enjoyed reading it and discussing it anyway. It's one of those that I think will provoke strong reactions, so it's quite fun to read for that reason. And I also just think Ishiguro is an author that I want to read all of his work, because his body of work, some authors, they write really differently across their books, and that's not to say that those books don't share things as well, but with his work particularly, I find that you can really see patterns and themes emerging, and I think they're really interesting to compare to one another. So for that reason as well, I think this one's worth reading. Yeah, I can't say we all wholly enjoyed it. We certainly all had strong opinions about it. Okay, now we're getting into the rest of the books. I'm going to go from the top of the pack to the bottom of the pack, so you're getting the best books first. I read so many good books in March and April. All-time favourites. Not even just yearly favourites, but like all-time favourites are in here. It's partly all down to my new ability to put books down that I'm not enjoying, my focus on what I already owned. It's just all really working for me at the minute, and I hope it continues. First up, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge and the Teachings of Plants. That's the little subtitle. This is gorgeous. I feel like I've talked about it a lot already, but I'll talk about it again. This is just a perfect non-fiction book for me, really. I listened to this one. I really recommend listening to it because Robin Wall Kimmerer reads it herself, and you can just feel her love for the world in her writing, and it's just a really wonderful listening experience. You can hear her actually speak Potawatomi. She's an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. She's also a botanist. And yeah, this book is a mixture of her sort of scientific knowledge, her Indigenous knowledge, and then also quite a large amount of memoir as well. And this blend is just perfectly done for me. You're going to learn so much from this book, I think. You know, the scientific and Indigenous knowledges really inform one another. One of the big themes here is reciprocity. That's her main driving force. You know, I think at the beginning she starts with this anecdote about teaching her students, and she asks them, is there a way for humans to live well with the land? Something like that. I can't exactly remember what it was. And, you know, all her students just comment on all the bad things that we do to the world, basically. And she is shocked to find that people these days maybe don't know ways in which they can actually live in reciprocity with the land. And, you know, as humans, we can really be caretakers of the land, and in turn it will take care of us. So that seems to be the driving force behind this book. So beautifully written, just absolutely wonderful. And it also taught me a lot about what I personally appreciate in non-fiction. I love a writer with a knowledge and appreciation of the literary, because I'm a literature student after all. You know, fiction is my thing, so I always appreciate when an author has that element to their work when they're writing non-fiction. But I think it goes further than that, because it's an acknowledgement that there is a very fine line really between the workings of fiction and the workings of non-fiction, and that non-fiction is a story too. When you read non-fiction, you're still reading a story. It may be a true or factual story, the way the information is presented is so intentional. It's usually to present a particular argument. And also, humans live by stories. The best way to get information across often is by storytelling. So the best storytellers are going to get the information across in the best way. That's like stage one. But stage two is just an acknowledgement of the importance of that. So Kimmerer has all of that. She is telling a good story. She also acknowledges the importance of the good story. To me, it feels more true to acknowledge, so like the aspects of memoir in here, you might be surprised to hear that there's memoir in here, but to acknowledge your own part is, I think, so important. It's so important to me as a reader, because the scientific mindset where you can be an objective observer of your surroundings is just, it's basically nonsense. I mean, it allows all sorts of damaging views to come into the conversation there. So if you just think about how patriarchal medicine is, for instance, or so much of science, kind of scientific, what has been investigated through science has such a skew, but it purports to be objective. So that scientific mindset, I think Kimmerer is taking that to task here. It's something I think about a fair amount as well. So to acknowledge your own position within that is really important to me as a reader, and to combine it with a knowledge of the literary, it just makes for a truly interdisciplinary reading, which is exactly the kind of thing that I love. I love fiction that's quite scientific. I love non-fiction that's quite literary. Because in the actual real world, these things blend. They are not separate disciplines. These are all important aspects of being a human. And I'm not bashing science, because obviously science and medicine and all this kind of stuff has brought us so many wonderful things and can tell us so many interesting things about the world. But you, I think, have to combine it with other modes of knowledge as well. And that is what this book is trying to do. And at the same time, the writing is beautiful. Like, she really delights in writing. Obviously, she was choosing between becoming a biologist and becoming a poet, she says, when she went to university. So, it's already there, that love of writing. So this is just a set of preferences on my part when it comes to my non-fiction, but I want self-reflexive non-fiction. I want non-fiction that is engaging with the idea of writing a factual story. And so that this book taught me that that's what I like, because this book does it perfectly, and I will be on the lookout for books that do it too. Underland by Robert Macfarlane, that really engages with the literary as well, and it's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed reading that book as well. It also shows me why I like fiction so much, because fiction authors, they are, the first thing they have to acknowledge to themselves is that they're telling a story, and you might learn lots of true things through that story, but they're picking a voice, they're picking, first person or third person, they're making lots of conscious decisions. And I like unpicking all of the threads of fiction to find out how the themes are working with the content. So yeah, it didn't just teach me what I love in non-fiction, but what I love in fiction. I just adored it. A life-changing experience, I suppose, on many levels, and I highly, highly, highly recommend this one. Went off on a complete ramble there, but I felt it was important to say. And if you can think of any books that fulfill that, I would love to hear it. And I know that they're just preferences. Like, you can enjoy non-fiction which doesn't engage with the idea of storytelling or writing, but I'm just saying that is the type of thing that really elevates a work of non-fiction for me. And I might read some of the stuff that doesn't do all those things and still really enjoy it, but that's what gets a piece of non-fiction into my all-time favourites, if you know what I mean. Let's move on. Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. Gorgeous, loved it, came at just the right time. As I've said before, it was, spring was starting to spring, and this is a book that has a real love of life. So this, in combination with Braiding Sweetgrass, I was just loving it. I've been meaning to read this novel for years and years and years, since I read Housekeeping at uni, and Housekeeping also is an excellent novel, by the way. This is about a preacher living in small town Iowa in about the mid-20th century. He became an old father, like he had a son much later in life than he planned or he thought he would, and he feels his body failing. He feels like, he might not live that much longer. So he writes this long letter that his son can have when he's a bit older, to teach him about his life, his ancestry, I suppose, like the people who came before him, his philosophies on life. He talks about his faith, obviously, and also at the same time it's kind of cathartic for our main character, John Ames, and he also just becomes preoccupied, I suppose, with various different things that he's never quite worked out in his life, and so he's working through them in this book. And it is just beautiful. It's a religious themed book, I suppose, but the way he talks about faith and he talks about people and he talks about life, you don't have to be super religious to appreciate it. It's done in a really wonderful way that's quite universally applicable. You know, you might not agree with absolutely everything, but just the world view is very generous, I would say. This is a kind of meandering novel. It returns to some key images again and again, but it felt, you know, symphonic to me in that sense. It felt very masterfully and very intentionally plotted. So although it feels sort of like we're meandering through his reminiscences, it isn't. I think it's a little bit tighter than maybe it appears. Like I say, it comes back to these images in a kind of iterative way. It's really nicely done and feels almost musical. And then it's a bit of a novel of two halves. In the first half, Ames is really talking about his father and his grandfather, and who are both preachers as well, but very different men, and the differences between them and how that affected him as a person. And then in the second half, one of his best friends has this wayward son who actually happens to be named after John Ames, because as I said, he came late to fatherhood and it looked like he was never going to have a child. So his best friend named one of his sons after John Ames, but this son happens to be very wayward and gets himself into scrapes and problems, and he returns to Gilead, which is the town, just at the time that Ames is writing this letter. He has always had this kind of quite strong dislike of this boy, and he feels uncomfortable with that. Obviously, as a preacher, he's supposed to be kind and forgiving, and he finds it very hard to be around this person. And it's interesting to see him work through that. You know, he's coming to the end of his life, so it's something he seems to want to work through. Also, this prodigal son is getting quite close to his wife and child, so he gets quite nervous about that aspect as well. So the second half of the novel is more focused on that. Honestly, it was wonderful, really, really wonderful. There are some gorgeous quotable sentences in here as well, and I loved it. It won't be for everyone. I think it is too meandering for some people. It doesn't feel like it has a really big driving force. I buddy read this with a few people and they didn't love it quite so much, so be wary of that. But if you do like quiet, reflective novels that are a little bit more subtle in their plotting, then I think you will like this one. I am so excited to read the other ones. I'm so glad when I went to America last year and I bought all 4 of these books that I did that, because I could have read this one and not liked it much, and then I would have had 4 of them sitting on my shelves. But I really, really loved it, and I'm so excited to read the other books. So this is the first in the series, and the rest of the series is told from the point of view of other characters in Gilead. So yes, next up, Paradise by Toni Morrison. This is a perfect book. It's a perfect book. Just like the other 2, this one is another perfect book, all-time favourite. I think my favourite Morrison reading experience ever, which I know is a bold thing to say. I haven't read Beloved for a number of years, and I'm going to return to it because I know that tends to be people's favourite Morrison. But as a reading experience so far in my life, this one is my current favourite. But where to start with it? So it's about an all-black town called Ruby in Iowa, I think? No, Oklahoma. And on the edges of Ruby, Ruby's in the middle of nowhere, and then on the edges of Ruby is this ex-convent, but it actually wasn't a convent, it was a school for girls run by nuns. The school doesn't exist anymore, but the convent, as it's called, becomes home to a selection of down and out women, for lack of a better term. Women, you know, that are running away from something or are in some sort of trouble, and they find their way somehow to this place. Now, their very presence seems to deeply disturb some of the founding members of Ruby, obviously all of them men. It disturbs a couple of the women, but the men decide to brutally attack them one morning. And the first kind of opening scene, that's what we're seeing. And then we move backwards in time through a number of different it's all third person, but we move through a number of different characters' perspectives, from the convent women to women in Ruby itself, to see how we sort of got to this point, basically. It's a longer Morrison novel. It's not massively long, but she didn't write many books of this length, and it requires a little bit of work on the part of the reader. Definitely. So be a little bit warned going into this, especially when you read reviews. You can see that some people just struggled with it, I suppose, because you do have to focus on this one. It's her version of a big cast of characters set in a small American town novel, which happens to be one of my favourite genres, mini genres, and this is Morrison's take on it, and it's just wonderful. But you have to closely follow the names, the links, the little hints in earlier. It can be just a sentence that then when you read something later on you'll be like, oh, that makes sense now. There's a lot of intricate plotting going on here, and of course, it being Morrison, the sentences themselves are lyrical. I feel like isn't even the right word, but they sound like poetry, you know, but that sometimes means they're a little bit difficult to decipher. So you've got a little bit of complexity on a few levels there. I was really glad I was writing notes when I was reading this book. I would note down things that didn't make sense, and then that would help me later on because I could put all the little pieces together. Just the mere act of writing it down. I didn't have to page through my notes constantly, but just the act of writing it helps solidify things in my brain. I liked writing notes because I could kind of link the characters up properly, work through my thoughts about the book. And finally, my final tip would be to read it fairly quickly. Like, don't read this one over like 4 weeks. If you can, I would read it within a week or two, because that will help you keep the threads of the plot together. And just generally, I think it makes it an incredible reading experience. I read it, I think, over 5 or 6 days, something like that. So you don't need to speed through it, but it was just such a wonderful experience. It's got this real cumulative effect, this book. I find that with Morrison novels in general, but you know, as you see her build layer upon layer with themes and characters and plot, just incredible. And yeah, if it sounds like hard work, it honestly isn't. It's so rewarding. I absolutely adored it, and you just have to read it to appreciate it, I think, fully without me talking too much more about it. So please go and read this book. Okay, White Cat, Black Dog by Kelly Link. These are amazing stories, reimaginations of fairy tales. Mostly they were fairy tales that I wasn't very familiar with, but I think Hansel and Gretel might be in here. I can't remember. Yes, there is a Hansel and Gretel in here. I generally hate the use of fairy tale in contemporary literature. It's usually really lazy in order to kind of make a nod at some sort of symbolism. I'm thinking of Mischief Acts, which I read last year, which used Herne the Hunter for some sort of like very half-hearted eco sort of storyline, which was just crap, to be honest. Sorry. I feel like they're used often to do the work that the author doesn't really want to do, but Link's reimaginations of these fairy tales / just the use of the fairy tale concept is just really good. She just does it really well. She very clearly deeply understands the sort of structure and significance of the concept of a fairy tale. You know, what is a fairy tale and what does it mean to be a fairy tale? I think Link grasps these things, and so she's really able to transpose it successfully into contemporary stories. I think she fully understands how weird a lot of fairy tales are. I think a weird author is the best person to take on a fairy. I think she is generally considered sort of a member of the new weird. I think a weird author is the best person to take on the fairy tale, because fairy tales are weird. I mean, they have strange logical turns in the plot. It's a bit dreamlike, where just things happen and you have no idea why. And so I think, again, that really works in Link's favour in these stories. She just does it really, really well. She puts them in contemporary settings or even futuristic settings. They're pretty much unrecognisable. Like, I don't think you would recognise the Hansel and Gretel one anyway, but I think that's exactly why it works. You know, she's not just half-heartedly copying the plotline of Hansel and Gretel. She's working with the original tale to do something new. They're not too on the nose, like the Mischief Axe that I read was, but they're not too kind of substanceless either. She does have some interesting themes in here, but you're just not whacked around the head with them. Her prose is really good. She has this sort of dark humour too, which I think works with the fairy tale. And in general, I was just really, really, really impressed by these. I had another Link collection on my shelf, but I actually didn't read the whole thing when I tried it a few years ago, so I'm interested to see if I like it more now I've read this, and I really like this, and it's been a few years. But yeah, there's a lot of good stories in here. One of my favourites is the one, I think it's towards the end, where a college student who is really struggling with his dissertation ends up house sitting for death, and he gets some weird visitors. I also really liked this one about a woman. She is in a layover, like she's delayed because of a big storm in this airport and its adjoining hotel, you know, these soulless places, and she's just really, really drawn to the swimming pool. It's like weird and atmospheric and wonderful. I like this one about a travelling band of actors who are avoiding the white road, which appears out of the corner of your eye in the day, but at night time you have to be sitting around a corpse, or creatures from the white road are going to come and get you. Very weird, very wonderful. In general, highly recommend. Yeah, I loved it. I reread / I listened to it this time round, David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I read this in preparation for Demon Copperhead, but ended up DNFing Demon Copperhead. I just wasn't a big fan of that book. It just didn't work for me for a few reasons, but I did love listening to this one again. I listened to the version read by Martin Jarvis, and he was really, really good. This is just one of Dickens's best, and I love it. I've talked about it before, but just love it. Now on to Biography of X by Catherine Lacey. You'll be, I think, a little surprised by this one if you read and loved Pew, because it's very, very different from Pew. This is like a big novel, big wordy novel, and it's set in an alternate United States where I think it's after World War II, because the North becomes increasingly socialist in this world. The Northern and Southern Territory split, and the Western Territory, but it tends to not figure as much in the story. So the Northern and Southern Territories split, and the South secedes and becomes a sort of North Korea-esque place, which is described as a fascist theocracy, super religious, quite restrictive down there. And the North is, you know, socialist, but it has its own selection of problems. But yeah, the South is like surrounded by a tall wall, you know, nobody can get out, etc., etc. But this is really just the background to a story about X and her wife. So X was a famous artist. She's recently died, I think kind of late 90s, early noughties. And her wife wants to write this biography of her to sort of set the record straight, because another biography was released of her recently and the wife, CM Luca, does not appreciate it. She doesn't like it, so she writes one herself. X was a very difficult, very uncompromising person, often very cruel for the sake of her art, you know, disregarding the people around her that loved her. So, despite the differences, there are some similarities in Pew and Biography of X. You can see some of the themes coming up again. So this time there's another problem of the main character's identity, but in this one, X takes on lots of different identities. So that's mostly the structure of this book, is taking us chapter by chapter through various periods of X's life where we're seeing them in different identities. And the other kind of major theme seems to be Lacey wrestling with her upbringing in the South, you know, her relationship to the American South. Of course, you can definitely see that maybe it's quite a stereotypical view to see the South secede and become this theocracy, but I do think she injects some nuance in there as well, just like in Pew with the sort of redemptive Southern characters who don't follow the Southern rules. Here we have there is a little bit of nuance there as well, so it's not quite as bad as it sounds. But yes, X, I don't think I'm spoiling it by saying that X was from the South and managed to escape to the North. And so much of, I think symbolically at least, even though we don't get as much of maybe the world building as I would have liked being a speculative fiction reader, so much of the story of X herself is the story of that North-South divide. What did I make of it? I really liked it. I thought it was good. I breezed through it pretty quickly. I don't typically like books about art, so obviously in this alternate US, I think Lacey does a wonderful job. So I wanted more maybe of the kind of talk of the North-South territory divide, etc., etc., but she also does a really good job of world building a kind of parallel art world, like what it might have looked like in the art world in this world. So I think the world building is really good. But yeah, I typically don't like books about art because I don't know much about art, and therefore it makes me feel a bit alienated a lot of the time. But because CM Luca is at a remove from the world anyway, she's a journalist, I think that helps because we have the outsider's perspective. I think there's lots of layers at work here. As I say, it's a wordy novel. There's so much packed in here about all sorts of things really. The life of the artist being like a major theme obviously, and like what it means to create art. I think it was slightly wobbly in places. Lacey said she wrote this over a number of years. I think Pew she wrote very quickly. This one she wrote over a number of years, and I think you can tell that it kind of got written and then rewritten and then rewritten again, because some kind of part, there's a little bit repetitive sometimes, maybe a little bit too didactic on the nose about artists at other times, and just some of its sort of shaggier parts never quite got subsumed into kind of what should have been a streamlined kind of final book. But I think it's a really, really interesting read, especially if you're sort of invested in Lacey after reading Pew as well. I think Lacey's going to be an author of the now. I think she's going to be one of our authors of the late 2010s, 2020s, and probably into the future as well, because she's pretty young, so I'm sure hopefully she'll be writing more in the future. I think she's one to really keep your eye on, because I think she's going to be important in the literary world. So next, a book that I don't have physically yet, it's 10 Planets by Yuri Herrera. Translated from the Spanish. Yuri Herrera is a Mexican author, and this was a very good collection of short stories, little bite-sized short stories, which I think will appeal to anyone who is a fan of the weird. They're extremely strange, but quite wonderful in their imagination. So, for example, one is about a gut bacterium that becomes conscious after coming into contact with LSD in the gut of some British man from like Surrey or something. Very, very strange. Another is about a detective who garners all of the information about his cases from people's noses. There's loads and loads of stories because they're quite short, and so you can breeze through them really quickly as well. But I think they would bear rereading because there's some interesting themes at work here about kind of language and being and boundaries. And yeah, I'm very interested in reading more Yuri Herrera. I think these are going to be too weird for some people, but for those of you who are invested in the weird as a genre, you will enjoy these, I think. Next, another book that I don't have, and that is Assassin of Reality, which is the follow-up to Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Jurchenko. I really enjoyed this one. It answered just enough of the questions that I had from the first book. I'm glad they had the balls to go ahead and actually answer some of those questions, you know, not make it too vague. It suggests to me they really had an underlying knowledge of what was going on in Vita Nostra, which meant that they could then come up with a sequel that made sense. And so I appreciate that, because I feel like some authors, especially of these slightly more difficult books conceptually, sometimes actually don't have that underlying knowledge, and I think you can tell. And I think that's why Vita Nostra works so well, because the authors know exactly what they're talking about. Maybe you don't. But I think the sequel proves that, and I'm glad that they just went ahead and actually answered some of the questions, because they could have just made it vague again. I just think it just would have detracted from Vita Nostra rather than added to it. I have seen some reviews saying that it's maybe a little bit too straightforward, this book. I personally think it still has a really good element of mystery to it. I think there are still some unanswered questions. It depends what you sort of like, but I don't think anything was ever going to feel quite as revelatory as Vita Nostra anyway, because if you're sticking with Sasha's story, you know, you have to stay within that world, so it can, I'm not sure you could continue that level of revelation, because it's already so strange. The ideas are fantastic, and yeah, sometimes the plot line is a little bit awkward. That's not really their thing. Their thing is more the ideas. Like, for example, we switched to a romantic relationship in this book that I was less convinced by. I also thought the first 50 pages was a bit like, just a bit stilted, but I think it's partly their style, and just partly that they're doing something entirely different in these books anyway. I thought it was a really fitting follow-up. I cannot wait for the third one, which has been confirmed in the final. Unfortunately, Sergei Jurchenko has actually passed away, so it'll just be Marina writing by herself, I think, for this third one, although I'm sure they must have discussed it. Interested to see how that kind of pans out, but I really liked the follow-up. I thought it was good. I don't think I was fully focused on it when I read it, so I think I might have to return to it. Next up, we have Close Range Wyoming Stories by Annie Proulx. This is a fantastic selection of stories set in Wyoming, funnily enough, just following a range of tough characters living these harsh, unforgiving lives. Again, I think mostly throughout the kind of 20th century sometime. The most famous story in this obviously being Brokeback Mountain, but there were some other real standouts here. The Half-Skinned Steer I loved, Job History. One thing I was surprised by, I suppose, is that I found her prose sometimes a little bit difficult to parse. I think for a couple of reasons. I think she really immerses herself in the sort of local character of Wyoming language. So for me, as a Brit living in the 21st century, that was sometimes difficult to just work my way through. Also a lot of technical ranching terms that I'm just unfamiliar with, and I don't know what's going on. So it just required me a little bit more concentration than I was maybe able to give it sometimes. It took me a little while to get through these because I was distracted anyway. But yeah, there's an innate lyricism to her language that often reminded me of Dennis Johnson, though I think his is a little bit more taut and distilled. But yeah, she has this lyricism to her language, but it also feels kind of strung out and bare and raw. If you like your tough 20th century American literature, you're gonna like this. I'm really looking forward to reading more of her work. I've got the shipping news, which I plan to read this year as well, and I think that's going to be slightly different. That was described as quite like a quiet, sensitive work, so I'm interested to see if the prose reflects that and if it feels very different from the one I just read. Okay, Guapa by Salim Haddad. This was Haddad's debut novel, and I was just really impressed with it. I thought it was a really strong debut. It's about Rasa, who is a gay man living in an unnamed Arab country. We follow him over the course of 24 hours, and just before the novel begins, his grandmother, who is basically his only relative, finds him in bed with his lover Taymor, and he also discovers when he kind of gets up that morning that his friend is missing, probably has been arrested, either for his work as a kind of political activist or because he works as a drag queen in Guapa, which is the gay bar. I think it has like an underground section where Marge puts on drag shows. Worried about the situation with his grandmother. He wants to be reunited with Tamor. He's worried about his friend who's just been arrested. So yeah, we kind of enter his world. We enter his mind for 24 hours. We learn more about him over its pages. It reminded me sometimes, although they're quite different stylistically, but reminded me of A Passage North, because we're following a character over a short period of time, kind of reminiscing about various different things that have happened in their life. So he's wrestling with the kind of reconciliation of his Arab and queer identities, especially, you know, he went to study in the US for a time and that changed his perspective on being Arab specifically. But yeah, there's a real sort of vulnerability, generosity, openness in this novel. The language has a really nice fluidity to it. It's got this immediacy to it, which it totally works because of the sort of 24 hours structure. And it just drew me into Rass's world. It made me care about him. It made me care about his friends. At the same time as all of his personal life stuff is going on, you know, also his country is facing turmoil, and the young people of the country are really trying to change things, but nothing's really happening, and it feels very disheartening, and it also endangers their lives. And so you have the kind of political aspect going on as well. I think he said he wanted to set it in an unnamed country, so you didn't have all the specifics of the politics, but that doesn't mean it's not political still. So you can see there's lots of layers here, there's lots of dynamics, there's lots of themes going on, and I think he handles them really well, especially considering it was his debut. I think the plot line is slightly unbelievable just as you get towards the end, but I'm willing to forgive him because I just thought this was really strong, and I would like to see what he reads next. Writes. Okay, next up, Finch by Jeff Vandermeer, back in Ambergris for the final Ambergris novel. This was a fitting end to the series. I enjoyed it. I preferred it to Shriek, which I didn't much like, which I read last year. Well, I did like it, but it wasn't quite to my taste. So this is Vandermeer in his detective novel mode, but beware, crime fiction fans, this is not going to take the usual route that a detective novel would take. I wouldn't jump into this one if you wanted to try Vandermeer, but you're a crime fiction fan, because it's just, you want to immerse yourself in the weird first, I think. We follow Finch. He is investigating this very bizarre, strange double murder, and the case takes him to places he could never have imagined and has much wider consequences than he ever could have imagined. But really what's happening in this book is the story of Ambergris, and there's a real progression from City of Saints and Madmen through Shriek into this book, so I really recommend you read the three of them in order, because otherwise you will miss things in this novel. Some of it might not make as much sense to you as it could do, and in general there's a real progression of how Ambergris is developing over the course of the three books, so really kind of key to read them in order, which I initially didn't realise. I'm glad I read them in order because that's what I tend to do anyway, but it actually does make sense to do it like that. So, because I thought they were sort of standalones, and they are sort of separate stories, but yeah, for the progression of Ambergris reasons, you want to read them in order. So I don't want to speak too much about what's happening in Ambergris in this book, just in case you haven't read the other books, but I think it's a really fitting end. So the story of Finch is kind of by the by. You get just enough characterization of him to make his sort of perspective interesting, but in general, in terms of the Ambergris books, that's what I'm reading for. I'm reading for the city because it's such an amazing imaginative creation, Ambergris, and it's one of my favourite Vandermeer worlds. And yeah, I liked the weird ending. It might not satisfy everyone, but it definitely was satisfying for me, and I enjoyed this one a lot. And I'm coming to the end of Vandermeer's works. I've not got many more to go, so yes, that's going to be crazy. So next up, All Your Children Scattered by Beata Umubyeyi Mairesse. I don't know if I'm quite saying that right, but I hope I'm saying it not too awfully, who is a Rwandan French author. So I read this very short novel over quite a long period of time, so I'm not sure I have quite the grip on it that I have with some of the other novels, but this is another debut, and it was another debut that I was very impressed with. This is a much more recent one, so this has just recently been released by Europa Editions. It's translated from the French. It's about a family coming to terms with the Rwandan genocide and this sort of inheritance of trauma, I suppose. It's narrated from the points of view of Immaculata, who's the mum, Blanche, who's the daughter, and then Blanche's son, Stokely, so 3 generations. And yeah, I think she manages the theme of inherited trauma really well. The revelations of the plot kind of come slowly over the course of the pages, and I think it really works. The pacing is good. As I said, it's not that long, so you could get through it quite quickly as well. So when I first picked it up, there is a lyricism here which put me on my guard, because so much of contemporary literature is all style and no substance. It drives me a little bit crazy. But this one, I think, just stops short of that, and therefore the lyricism, the poetry of the language really enhances what Mairesse is doing here, which is exactly what the language should do in a book. Obviously, this is a book about some deeply, deeply traumatic things, so be warned about that going in. By the way, I've realised that Storygraph has a really great approach to like content warnings, and so I will, if something needs a content warning specifically, I will put the Storygraph link into the description box, so that you can go and check them out. But if you're not interested in content warnings, because sometimes they do contain spoilers as well, then you don't have to go and check them out, if you know what I mean. But anyway, so some horrible things happen here, obviously. It's about the Rwandan genocide, but I think she really manages to write about it without it becoming trauma porn or too much, and instead actually talking about it in an important way about, you know, a nation and a family coming to terms with their history, essentially. So that is All Your Children Scattered, and I really recommend it. Then we have Foster by Claire Keegan. This was a lovely little story. It's really not even a novella. I listened to this. Please don't listen to it, because the narrator's pretty crap, and I don't think that she gets the most out of the emotional heft of this book. This is a heartwarming but also heartbreaking tale, very much like Small Things Like These, which I read last year, about a young girl sent to stay with a couple over the summer. Not really even family friends, kind of like strangers basically, who have recently lost their own child, and she's sent to stay with them, and at home she's kind of nigh on neglected because her family have a lot of children, a lot of mouths to feed, and they're really focused on just surviving. And in this household she receives affection, she receives, you know, attention and love, and she sort of flourishes, I suppose, under that, and she realizes a lot of things about life, and she really enjoys living with this couple. It seeks to show how even the smallest of acts, the smallest of moments, can have such a huge effect on a person, especially on a child. Keegan just really depicts life in what feels like a very accurate way, and shows the beauty of life, which is something I love. I wish he would write something longer. I don't know if this is just her thing, short fiction, and I think she does it really, really well. And I don't think the stories that she's written should be longer necessarily, because she obviously writes for the form and she gives us little snippets and it works. But I would love to see her write something longer and see if she can kind of sustain that, because it's really beautifully done. But maybe also she's just good at this short fiction and kind of touching on the small things of life. So yes, really, really recommend Foster. You can literally breeze through it in about an hour. The audiobook is about an hour and a half. Next, All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. I actually finished this one in May, but I thought if I don't include it, I'll forget all about it by the time I come to my next roundup. So this is the first in the Border trilogy. I obviously read and loved The Road last year. I've wanted to read more McCarthy since. For some reason I had the Border trilogy on my shelves, so I thought I would start there. It's about John Grady, who is a teenage boy. His grandfather has just died. His grandfather owned a ranch, and Grady always expected to work this ranch and loves horses. He has a special affinity for horses, but his slightly wayward mother who's gone and become an actress. She's abandoned her husband and child and gone to become an actress. In the aftermath of his grandfather's death, you know, the ranch went to her, it was her father. She decides to sell it. So his future that he planned is sort of snatched away from him. His father is about to die. He's got some sort of terminal illness, I think. And so he decides to ride down to Mexico for seemingly no reason at all with his best friend Rawlins. This is set in the mid-20th century, so there are fence lines, there are cars. It's kind of like a post-Western Western. Of course, there's some awkward exoticism of Mexico here as a place to go and find yourself and a place to come of age, and there's some colonial overtones here. They're impossible to ignore. I'm not really surprised that they're there because this was written in the early 90s, you know, if you consider McCarthy's age. I think the reason to read McCarthy is if you like his style. I love his strips back style. There's some paragraphs here that really just completely took my breath away. But this was not as big of a success for me as The Road. It just lost me. I just wasn't massively invested in the storyline for whatever reason. Maybe it's, you know, teenage boy comes of age on a horse sort of vibes. It just didn't really appeal to me, whereas with The Road you have that parent-child dynamic which really did appeal to me, and also the sort of mystery of the apocalyptic setting, which would obviously appeal to me as well, whereas this one just not so much. I didn't feel the urge to pick it up. It just took me a little while to read. There were some really excellent sections, but then, you know, it would lose me again. You know, there were some sections which just read like schoolboy shootout fantasy, and just, as for me as a reader, it just doesn't appeal to me. So a mixed bag. I think I'm going to continue with the Border trilogy to kind of see whether the overarching story of the 3 books sort of redeems a little bit or just makes a bit more sense. Because sometimes when you fit books together, they work a bit more. Because this is very much a book about youth and the naivety of youth and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if the other ones will add different dimensions to it. I'm just interested in McCarthy as an author as well. I just find his style really interesting. So I think I'll be continuing to read him even if I don't always feel 100% about his books. Next we have Ascension by Nicholas Binge. This is a arc, obviously, so that's why it kind of looks weird. This is a really solid science fiction read. Again, it was published this year. So it's about a mountain that appears suddenly in the middle of the sea. It's absolutely colossal, and one expedition of scientists has already gone up the mountain to investigate, and of those who have returned, they've come back weird. So already you can sense Annihilation vibes. They definitely slapped Annihilation all over the PR for this one. So our protagonist is a physicist who is going to go up on the 2nd expedition, and he very quickly discovers some very, very strange things about this mountain. I thought the character writing was good, and like the narrator was good. He was well written, well rounded. 3D character. I thought the concept was interesting. I thought it was well executed. I thought the writing was smooth and enjoyable and took you along with the story. I liked that it was pacey. We got to that mountain pretty quick. We didn't dilly-dally, because when you're reading a book like this, I mean, sometimes, you know, authors it can take you like half the book just to get to the meat, but here we got to the mountain nice and quick. I think the bit that I was slightly disappointed by was that it just didn't quite meet the heights of weirdness, the heights of sort of concept that I was hoping for. I think I read so much weird fiction that it just slightly fell short of what I was expecting it to do. But it does have some, you know, it does have some really interesting ideas, but they're sort of revealed and complete by the time you get 2/3 of the way through. So there's not much more in the last third rather than just like straight up plot line. But it did have some really interesting concepts and ideas in it. There is a kind of final reveal as well, but it didn't seem like massively mind-blowing to me. In general though, I will definitely investigate more of Binge's work. I think this is his 2nd book, so I would like to see what he writes next. I think it was really like a strong sci-fi, and I would recommend. So on to the books that I just didn't actually really like, which are thankfully very few. We've got My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. I am not a Mosfegh fan, and that is fine, and I'll tell you why, because I think she's taught me something important about my taste. Yes, so my favourite books are written from a deep love and understanding and appreciation of life and people. In fact, I think it's something that I look for in all my books, and if they don't have it, I don't like it. So this one actually had some really lovely warm moments in it. McCarthy, even though he's very kind of has this very masculine style and is often thought of as a very manly author, there were some lovely moments between Rawlins and Grady in this, like the two friends. There was a romance story in this. I always love his children writing. There are a couple of small moments with children in here which I just love. Foster obviously extremely warm. Even in the weirdness of Finch, there was a very kind of close friendship between Finch and one of his colleagues. I could go on, but I love for there to be tenderness and humanity and warmth in my books. And I want the author to, even if there's a lot of darkness in the book, I want the author to write from that space, like at their core. But with Mosfegh, I feel like, I don't know about her as a person, but I feel like her as an author at least is writing from a deep disdain and disgust with humanity. You can disagree with me if you like, but that is that's the vibe I get, that's the feel I get. And more than anything else, more than anything kind of in terms of her literary prowess, whether she's got any or not, that's the bit that I don't like the most. There are inklings maybe of hope at the end of her books, but she's not known for the best of endings or the most fitting endings or the endings that work with the rest of the book. In both Eileen and this one, the endings have really felt kind of tacked on and rushed. I don't think she quite knows how to write those moments of hope, at least in the two books that I've read. But yeah, I think I preferred Eileen to this one. I think Eileen just appealed to me a little bit more. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this book, but it's about a woman who essentially just takes a bunch of sleeping pills for a year in an attempt to reset and get out of this horrible depressive rut that she's in. You know, there were things to appreciate. I think Mosfegh's prose is very smooth, but there are definitely some eye-roll worthy sentences here and there, some generalizations which I just think a good editor maybe should be picking up on those and going, do you really want to say that? There's some childhood trauma discussed, which sort of explains the narrator, so there's a bit of backstory. Do I think they're particularly clever books? As much as kind of, because she's a literary author, right? I don't think there's that much depth. I don't think there's enough subtext for me to justify the levels of kind of cynicism and pessimism and the storylines that we get. Maybe you could justify them a bit more if there was a really strong subtext or a really strong theme that she was trying to get across, but I just don't see it. I just don't find it. She's good at inhabiting a voice, but I don't think she's very good at creating, like, I think she sort of maybe inhabits the voice and writes, but I think maybe there just needs to be more for me as a reader. I can't really explain it, but it's a bit hollow for me. Not in the way that other contemporary literature is, when it's like uber lyrical and just about nice sentences essentially, and then it's missing a subtext and also a plot and all sorts of things. Hers, she's quite easy to read. It's not super lyrical, but it's got the same problem for me. I would have liked for it to engage with maybe the concept of illness a bit more, or you know, depression, or I don't know, I wanted to engage with its topics a bit more, but it's more like I took an Ambien, then I had a nap, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know, the positives are, I've read Eileen, I've read My Year of Rest and Relaxation now, and I can just say, do you know what, I don't think she's an author for me. I'm sure I will still get recommendations saying, oh, but you should try this one or this one, but she's just not an author I'm going to prioritise. You know, there's so many authors out there which appeal to me more, and that's okay. I'm glad to have learnt that. That's a useful learning. It's a useful learning to know that I need something tender in my books. I'm sentimental. So finally, the new Atlantis by Ursula Le Guin. It's basically just a short story in ebook form that I got out from the library. I didn't even dislike this, but it was just a non-event basically. I just read it for completist reasons. It's a perfectly serviceable story about a future world. She wrote it in the 70s. It's about a future world where climate change has sort of wrecked everyone's quality of life, and they live in this sort of authoritarian state in the US now. You know, they're closely surveilled, and it was decent, absolutely decent, but just not Le Guin's best work. She made a couple of odd choices, like making marriage illegal, but actually it had quite an interesting little introduction on the front where she explained why she made the choices that she did back in the 70s and how things panned out differently to how she imagined, and how also at the same time she was sort of paying attention to the warnings of scientists and why she was able to write about climate change so convincingly. Even then, she admits that the kind of marriage thing was a weird choice. I actually found that introduction like the best bit about reading it, but it was literally about 40 pages. I read it pretty quickly. I just got it ticked off my list because, you know, I'm completing some of her work this year. I'm not doing literally all the short stories, but I'm definitely doing her novels and bits and bobs. So we ticked it off, and that is fine, but I wouldn't recommend it to anyone really. Okay, so that is that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. And I'm going to try and make these monthly again because it's just too many books. It's too many books. Bye!